I think we're ended up with maybe 70% from last year.
Yeah.
So it's just ends up being, everybody's doing their best.
Yeah, I mean, this for me has been good being home because I had a lot of time to really organize a lot of my stuff that over the past maybe 10 years has fallen out of my. I'm a Virgo and have to be organized. And over the past 10 years, I've really been ashamed of myself for letting things go the way they've gone.
Well, I mean, I'm a OCD freak, so I'm the same kind of way. Like I organize my iPhoto. You know what I mean? Like I'll go there and be like, it's like we played this show at this place on this date. I want to see it on the map, and then I want all the pictures. When I hit that picture on the map, I want to see all the play. I want to see the pictures from the show.
Well, a lot of times what I do too, like every event I do, every person I talk to, like they have a file, and so like over the past like years, I've been doing so many, like there just became this stack. So now like you have your file.
Well, that's the Bill Clinton method, right? Everybody gets a card.
Yeah.
And I mean, he did pretty well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could look in your file and tell you like when we met in Wisconsin, like what we generally talked about, like the location it was at, just so I know I can look back later.
This guy drove me home when I stayed across from the strip bar.
Yep.
All right, we'll go live in 5 seconds. I'll just do a quick introduction, and then we'll get going.
Sure.
Okay, everybody, come on in, attendees, to our final presentation of the evening. And this is also one of my favorites, and we're so excited he's going to join us. We first met John E.L. Tenney at the Michigan Paranormal Conference in 2017, and he regaled us just at the bar with awesome stories about being at an exorcism. And I remember Wendy, the drummer in my band, and co-host in the podcast, she's still like, that was like the scariest story I ever heard in my life. And still, ends up being, and so like from that moment, we're like, all right, we got to know more about this guy. So having him come to Milwaukee Paracon online 2020 is just a delight. Anyway, you might have seen him in a show like Ghost Stalkers. He's featured in Hellier, which is highly recommended. Shows up, Kindred Spirits. And so you see him on TV. You hear him on his podcast, Realm of the Weird, and Weird Lectures. Anyway, I'm going to get out of the way because John is a cornucopia of paranormal knowledge and stories and fun. So he's going to talk for a little bit. And then if you guys have questions, we're going to put them in the comments and we'll be able to talk to John. So everybody, please welcome, give a big warm Wisconsin or wherever you are welcome to Mr. John E.L. Tenney.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me here. It's good to talk. It's nice. It's the middle of, it's like not nighttime. It's not 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm in my house. This is a great way to do conferences for me, especially taking care of parents. But I'm glad to be able to talk to you. And I feel like today, I was thinking all day about what I was going to talk about. And I realized like, I just don't get a chance to talk about ghosts anymore. Like I love talking about ghosts and I love thinking about it and paranormal and supernatural stuff, obviously. Like, but sometimes because of the situation we're in, let's just talk about ghosts. So it actually popped into my mind because I went past the first house where I ever thought I saw a ghost yesterday. I was driving around and I decided to see if that house, I know it had burned down, which is part of seeing a ghost there. But they had built new houses on it. So very poltergeist when I drove by and I was like, oh, I wonder if the people who live there know what happened in that house. But that was the first time. I was 15 years old. The girl I was dating at the time lived there and she thought she had a ghost in her house. I was the only person she knew who knew anything about ghosts. So it became my job to, I don't know, exorcise the ghost, get the ghost out of her house. And I did see something. It was very strange. It was very transparent. I tell people all the time, it looked like Predator. That was my only frame of reference at the time. And about 6 months after I saw it, I don't think it left, whatever it was, the house burned down. No one was hurt. The family had moved out by that time, but now there's a new house built there. Which brings to mind my questions that any of you who've ever heard me speak before have done lectures and investigated for over 30 years. You know that I think about things and how they apply to what we know or think that we know about ghosts. And the majority of people, I'm pretty convinced, in the world think that ghosts are just people, but invisible, and they've died, and they can walk through walls, and maybe they can move stuff. But as you investigate strangeness and paranormal phenomena, you realize that that is very lacking, because all we do throughout our lives is grow and change. So if we apply that process, which the universe shows us it does with everything from planets to stars to nature itself, everything grows and changes. So when you die, another process of change. And once you're dead, paranormal researchers and people who do ghost hunting, they have this idea in their head, and it's a singular idea. You find it across so many people, that once you die, you just stay the way that you are. And so you'll go into a house where a 6-year-old boy died 110 years ago, and they'll talk to a 6-year-old boy, or think they're talking to a 6-year-old boy, without ever realizing that that boy's been in that house for 100 years, but we don't know how they experience time. It might only be a second to him, but it might seem a lot longer, since there's no gauge for him to gauge time. But he also is experiencing the world. If ghosts don't have a corporeal form, if they don't have a physical form, he's experiencing the world in a much different way. We only understand colors and shapes and size and distance and sound because we perceive them with our biology, with our physical biology. If you don't have physical biology, then how do you experience the world? You see different spectrums of light, sound, perhaps. You experience sound in a different manner. You experience touch in a different manner. And that would naturally evolve, change, and grow you. So even though you had been human at one time, you are no longer a physical human. Years and years ago, I was they tried to spin off the show Paranormal State. And they did an episode, and in the episode, one of the researchers said, well, we're talking to a human. And I said, we're talking to something that seems like it used to be human. And the producers stopped, and they were like, what does that even mean? And I said, well, we're not talking to a human. And we don't know if what we're talking to was human, or if it's something pretending to be human, or if it's something that was human and isn't any longer. And they said, well, we can't talk about that. Like, no one's going to be able to get that. But we get that. As paranormal researchers, our minds expand beyond what we see on television. And when we read books, we ask each other questions, and we question ourselves as to what we are really experiencing. And a lot of times in the paranormal world, we talk about these kind of liminal states or crossroads. And you always hear about people who pass away and they've passed over, and now they're in this in-between world, very Twilight Zone-y. Like, that language surrounds the place where we stop living in a physical body and perhaps exist somewhere else. We always talk about that as a borderland or the Twilight Zone. But the reality of the situation is that life is the borderland. There is infinity behind us, and there's infinity in front of us, and we are in the liminal state right now. Our existence is the middle ground. We didn't exist for millions and millions of years, as far as we know. We now inhabit a body, we experience a physical universe, and then we go back to where we came from. So you'll hear people say things after someone dies, like they went home, or they went back. So there is something in us that understands that death isn't the borderland, that this reality is what is most unreal. If you apply even waking and dreaming, if you apply that kind of logic to waking and dreaming, you spend the majority of your life alive, and these weird intermittent times unconscious, where all of this crazy shit happens. Dinosaurs riding bicycles and people drinking Slurpees while frogs hop by, and it's just nonsense. Dream world. If you take waking and the dream world, the majority of time is awake. The liminal time is dreaming. And so if you apply that to existence and non-existence, then non-existence on either end, that's actually waking. What we're in now is a dream world, which is why there's colors and sights and sounds and shapes and birds and monkeys and all sorts of strange stuff. So our reality is unreal. And I think it's really interesting that when you have paranormal researchers and ghost hunters looking for ghosts, they go into places and they say things like, can you tell me how you died? But you go into that location usually knowing how that person died. So you already know the answer to the question. Or they'll say, how old were you when you died? Can you see me? Now that's an interesting question, because you might get a response, yes. The next question should be, how do you see me? What does it look like where you're at? Like, it's very sometimes maddening to me that people don't try and discern more information of what the other side, the larger side, is like. If there are people there and they are able to communicate with us, what do I look like to you? How do you experience the world? How do you touch things if you don't have a hand? It's very easy for me to move this cigarette around because it exists in this physical world with my physical hand, and I have a muscle and I have arms and I can move it around. But if something moves by an unseen hand, how did it move? And if ghosts are just invisible versions of us, it seems very uninspired to me in a universe that loves strangeness and weirdness. I propose that it's very odd that most of the time, in a lot of instances, we're experiencing a form of communication with another reality, and those beings within that other reality that is occurring by interacting with us at a much deeper level, a more basic brain consciousness reality interpreting level that, and people who have seen my lectures before know I talk about this, for someone to create a physical body that you see, like the energy expenditure to grab particles, even just enough to bounce light off so that you can see it through your eye, that's a huge amount of energy expenditure. But if you have an image in your mind, and this non-corporeal being who works at some unknown energetic level, if they can trigger a visual of themselves or of something similar to themselves, simply by firing a single neuron, much less energy expenditure. And then that has the exact same effect as allowing you to see them in front of you. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not there. It means that they're doing something that's much more intimate. They're actually interacting with your brain. And if you don't have an image of them, it's possible that we have, as human beings, preset archetype imagery inside of our heads. So that you will commonly hear people talk about seeing a woman in white or a shadow figure. Those might just be default images that are set in our brain. And so let's say a ghost can't find a good image of itself. So it just uses silhouette of man, and it triggers silhouette of man. And then you see a shadow person, woman in wedding dress, like you've seen it. Boom. So that brings up another great thought experiment for you to think about, which is if they are able to use images in our head that are there for one reason or another. I mean, your grandfather that you've seen throughout your life is easy. You've got a lot of images in your head. He can pick which one he wants. That's why you hear people say, oh, I saw the ghost of Grandpa. He was wearing his favorite hat and his favorite boots. He looked like he always looked. It's grandpa using your favorite image of him or his favorite image of him in your brain, and then you see him. But again, like I said, the good thought experiment is, as we see more and more things, we have more and more available imagery in our brain for them to use. And so you would think that some entities that would be able to use those synaptic firings in your brain to create a visual image might do that, even if they're not ghosts. And so you've probably seen movies that have cavemen or aliens or monsters or strange creatures, elves and gnomes. And perhaps those are the images that they use just to be silly. Or maybe that's what they really look like. Maybe that's what they look like, and they've used the imaginative process to get inside the brains of movie directors and science fiction authors and horror authors, so that one day in the future, someone will draw a picture of what they look like, and then they can use that picture because you've seen it. Now they can look like what they've always looked like, because now you have the image in your head. If that were so, then you might be able to see trends along things in art, fiction, music. And you do. If you look at the way that fiction authors, imaginative process, if you look at how they slowly advance a certain idea, it seems as if the whole group is being pushed in a certain direction. You see this with the UFO phenomenon, where they go from big Zeppelin airships to things that look like jets, to things that look like saucers, to things that look like weird amorphous balls of light flying through the sky. Like, as our fiction and as our imagination has broadened, so is how they looked. And it's very interesting to me to think that they might be the ones that are pushing us to be able to get to the image that they want to be. Now, I talked about this at a lecture recently, and I talk about it at my lectures sometimes because it seems silly, but I think it's important. And it's important for us to talk about silly things, because what we are talking about is invisible dead people and magic crystals and people from outer space and monsters, and that's pretty silly. And there's nothing wrong with being silly. I think the world needs more silly and more weirdness. So I talk about ghost underwear because I find it way more important than I think most people take into account. But if a ghost is creating an image of itself in the outer world to experience, if it's not happening in your brain, then a lot of times they're wearing clothes. So if you were going to wear clothes, you wouldn't wear just the top layer of clothes. You wouldn't wear just a shirt and pants. That's not how people wear clothes. You would wear a shirt and pants and underwear. So are they expending extra energy to be correct by manifesting underwear underneath their pants that you will never see anywhere? And why would they expend that extra energy? But then that leads me to the question of, where do they get their clothes? If you tried to imagine your clothes right now that you're wearing, could you do it? And how close could you get to actually creating your clothes in your mind? Even if I asked you right now to write down what you're wearing, and I asked you how many buttons are on your shirt, how many ridges are in the top of your sock that go around your sock, how many stitches are in the toe of the sock, how many rivets are on your pants, on your jeans. Like, do you know all that stuff? Because if you're going to create it from scratch, from your mind, it would be important to know. When people see Civil War soldiers, I mean, someone stamped the buttons. Those buttons are embossed. So each of those buttons, who stamped those buttons? Who sewed their coats? Like, all of that has to come from somewhere, doesn't it? I mean, the universe might just be being strange. It might just be it might be way simpler than I'm giving it credit for. It might just be making a whole bunch of fucked up, crazy stuff happen with no explanation. It doesn't need any explanation. It's just meant for us to communicate with each other. And if that's all ghosts are, if all ghosts and aliens and monsters, if they don't actually exist, if all they are is a mechanism for us to talk to each other about the strangest parts of our life, then that's a massively important thing. Like, I see people all the time saying, like, well, people are more open to the ideas and people talk more openly about their weirdness. They talk more openly about ghosts and UFOs. But people have always wanted to talk about that stuff. They've always thought about it. And they might seem like they talk about it more because we're inundated with social media. And so we see more of people's thoughts. But humankind has always been fascinated by these things. The thing that's most fascinating to me, though, about that aspect of human beings always being intrigued by the unknown is that we didn't start sooner and we didn't collectively compile information and talk to each other about the things that we were concerned about. You have 3 cavemen, however many thousands of years ago, standing around with each other, and one of them dies. You would have thought at that moment, the other 2 cavemen, cave women, cave people, would have looked at the one that was dead and said, what the hell just happened to him? Why did it happen? And is it going to happen to me? And in that moment, start researching the process of death and what happens if something happens, and why it happens, and what that would lead to. But instead of having that deep conversation and everyone starting to have it and everyone discussing it, people were like, just dig a hole and plant him in the ground like a seed, maybe he'll grow again. And now tens of hundreds of thousands of years later, we have cemeteries all over the world where we dig holes and we put people in the ground hoping they'll grow back later. Like, we just stopped thinking about it. And I understand that people are like, well, it's a worry, it's a fear, death. People don't want to think about it. It's an inevitability, like it's going to happen to all of us. And we all know it somewhere deep in the back of our brains, no matter if we say we're not afraid of it or not. There is something back there that picks at you late at night. But as paranormal investigators, you see people clad in black t-shirts and covered in bats and skulls and bones and cobwebs. And it's very spooky. And I understand all of that. But we're really not interested in death. We're interested in more life. What we're doing is not scary and spooky. What we're doing is very illuminating. It's very hopeful. And I get really angry with modern television shows and the portrayal of people who are interested in ghost hunting as it being spooky and demons and scary and evil. Because what we really are doing is looking for more life. We're hopeful. And I understand the kind of panicked feeling in a dark room if something touches your shoulder. But what you're really doing is important and hopeful and kind and caring. And that should help to shape us too, not just the spooky part, not just the part that freaks people out and scares people late at night. The more important part, the part that challenges us to be better people, to look toward a more hopeful future where maybe together all of us join in some giant energy river and discuss how weird it was when we were human. I'm going to take questions. I will end my lecture the way I normally end it, after I take questions. I'm going to put my headphones in. If you have questions, let's ask them up. I'm going to look in the room here, see what I got. I don't know why I put those in to read. This is my mind right now. Okay, who's got a question? Throw them in there. I see the chat happening. Or even Mike, if you've got a question. What have I been reading lately? Honestly, I've been reading a lot of old fiction, a lot of weird and horror fiction from the turn of the century. I'm looking for patterns in fiction, which I talked about a little bit earlier, because I find it very interesting that we're going through we always talk about a renaissance or like a reoccurrence of this thing, of something, whether it's music or dance or a style. But what's interesting is that we say that because it is a repeating pattern. And I'm looking for archetypes in old fiction that were probably archetypes in folklore, which were probably archetypes in spoken stories that were passed down long before writing. So a lot of fiction, old fantastic novels and old amazing stories, and Arthur Machen and Chambers and Algernon Blackwood. So that's what I'm reading right now. Yep, I see.
One, and I want to ask you this one because we don't have the time to like sit at the bar afterwards and shoot the shit like usual. So, but when you talked about the idea of archetypes and that default image, first of all, the woman in white or the shadow person as the default image, as like the default Facebook user that your parents are using as their picture, right? That everybody's parents use their picture. That idea, it made me think about, and Eric Larson in the chat as well. He's working on a paranormal convention in Madison coming in 2022. But the idea of sense of the paranormal. Josh Cutchin wrote a great book called The Brimstone Deceit about how sulfur approaches all these kind of things. And to me, it felt like sulfur pushed us into some kind of programming mode. And then all of a sudden we're either seeing Bigfoot, aliens, ghosts, demons, or the machinery elves. So I just wanted to jump in and get kind of your idea about the sense of the paranormal and a little bit more on that default stuff that we're responding to archetypes like you were just talking about. Well, and then we'll get to more questions.
Stay right there because I want to answer that. I think it's really interesting. And I read Josh's book and liked it a lot. And I think what's interesting, again, is like, when we see archetypes or experience archetypes, whether it's scent or touch, or because I think they exist for all of our senses, and maybe senses we don't recognize we have. But it's interesting to me that we talk like brimstone, right? Like it's always associated with demons and evil and whatever. But it's also associated with like conjuration of angels, and it's also smelled a lot. It never gets talked about because people don't think it has any. Josh talks about it. The people smell brimstone around Bigfoot sightings. Like, so this is a thing. But what interests me when I say like I have a default woman in white and you have a default woman in white, or I have a default brimstone scent, you have a default brimstone scent. It doesn't mean that they're the same scent. Like that's the other thing too. Like you'll hear people say like, oh, I smelled rose perfume. Now that's someone who smelled rose perfume and they're recounting that scent. But I might just say I smell wildflowers because I've never smelled rose perfume. So we might be experiencing the same scent, but because I don't have a larger knowledge base than you do, I'm going to a default. So if I say I see, this is one of the problems with language. If I say I see a tree or imagine a tree, if everybody who's watching right now, imagine a tree, we're all going to imagine a tree, but none of us are imagining the same tree.
And what if you grew up in Iceland where there are no trees?
Right. And so when you hear someone say like, I smell brimstone, right? Like how many people have actually smelled brimstone? Like you've smelled burning things before, but have you actually smelled, when was the last time you actually really smelled sulfur gas, like, and brimstone?
Right. The funny thing is everybody's like, oh man, like somebody has too many eggs or whatever. And they're like, oh God, that smells like sulfur. And I'm like, what? Are you a chemist? When's the last time you smelled sulfur?
Right. So even our scents, like when people say, I feel touched on the shoulder, like that's a default too, because someone will say, oh, I just got touched. But touch is very different to me. Like touch has a physical push. Like I can feel the fingers going in. When I say a ghost touched me or a form touched me, I'm talking about I can feel an impression go into me. Now, for some people, it's just a grace on their shoulder. It's just their clothing kind of moved or their hair went back. And so we're using default language because language is such a terrible way to communicate, but it's the only one we've got. And so that's another difficulty in trying to figure out what these archetypes are telling us and how we want to experience them. Because if you're seeing your default woman in white and I'm seeing my default woman in white and we're standing next to each other, we think we're seeing the same thing because I'm going to say a woman in white and you're going to say a woman in white. And we're going to be like, oh, it's there. But it might not. It just is here.
And so do you think that sometimes we might be experiencing something paranormal, like you're talking about, where we're being, it's touching a neuron. It's the grandmother cell theory, right? The idea that there's a neuron for every single face that we recognize. But when we have some kind of experience, could it be, people see the things that they believe in? If you think Bigfoot is reasonable, like, oh yeah, well, hey, Bigfoot's just an ape we haven't discovered yet. Or if you think aliens are reasonable because there are so many planets out there, versus like fairies. What are you, Arthur Conan Doyle?
Right.
So you think that like sometimes paranormal experiences can be whatever's out there is just touching the thing that we think is a reasonable thing to believe in.
Right. And I talked about this. I did a convention a few years ago at Michigan Dogman, or a Dogman convention in Defiance, Ohio a few years ago. And one of the things I brought up with Linda Godfrey was, if someone goes out looking for the Dogman and they see a Sasquatch running away, they're going to say that they saw a Dogman because you've never seen a giant, hairy, upright running thing. And so you're going to be like, oh, I was looking for this giant, upright running dog, and I saw a giant, upright running, hairy thing. That must be the Dogman. But it could have been Sasquatch. And now your brain and just your perception and your ideas that you went into it with have shaped away from the actual thing that you might have seen.
Sounds good. Let's jump into the comments and questions for John here. What we've got, I know we've got a few. Veronica, what do you think about the difference between paranormal experiences that are perceived as good, or energies that are good, versus energies that might be evil?
So again, I think that this is all I think that our experiences, and as researchers, we always want an explanation. We always want to figure it out. I think that a majority of supernatural, paranormal, whatever you want to call them, experiences, I think they're meant to be personalized. And so when you start applying good and bad to things, again, these are judgment calls that are being made by you. So if, like, I don't think that this is always controversial and people get mad at me for saying this. I don't think that there's a good and a bad. I don't think that there's evil, and I don't think that there's ultimate good. I think that there's an endless gray gradient of those things. And my perception of them is based on my experiences. So I think it's interesting that the majority of time when I encounter people who say that something is evil, they have an inset belief in themselves of what is good and what is bad. And they're judging against that instead of looking at it from a full dynamic range. So years ago, my mentor told me this little analogy, which was, if I took a map of the world that had every city of every place on the world, if I took that map, giant map, probably 8 foot by 8 foot wide, if I had folded it and stood across the street from you and asked you to read me all the names of the cities, you couldn't do it because I'm too far away. So I would walk up to you and I'd put it against your nose and I'd say, now do it. And you wouldn't be able to do it because I'd be too close. So then you have me back up and stand at a place where you can read all of the place names on the map. And then I ask you, okay, what does it look like from my side of the map? You couldn't. And this is the way we experience life. We're either too close to the situation, we're too far away, or think we're seeing it perfectly, but we're not looking at the other side of it. And I think that applies not just for paranormal, I think that applies to our whole life. And when people say evil ghost, like, that's something I talk about in my lectures too. Everybody that's watching this right now is a nice person and they're all very fine, and that's because you can get up and leave anytime you want. But if you were trapped alone in your house, really trapped, you couldn't go outside, you couldn't leave the chair that you're in for a year or 10 years or 50 years, you might become frustrated, you might get mad, you might get angry. And then if someone somehow makes contact with you, you're either so excited or angry you lash out, and the person's like, oh, there's something demonic in this room. When in reality, you were just trying to say hello.
That, right, Zach Baggins, like,
right.
Do you want to hurt me, man? Right.
Yeah, that's not a great way to have a conversation with anyone. I mean, human beings have difficulty talking to other human beings when they're sitting in front of you. And you wouldn't go to a bar and walk up to someone you don't know and smack their back and say, like, talk to me now. Like, that's just a terrible way to engage a conversation with someone. You sit down, you form a rapport, you build a rapport with a person, and then if you want to talk, you talk. And I feel like that's the way that you engage with the strange.
Awesome. Couple more questions from the chat. Darcy, have you ever gotten an answer after asking, what are you seeing from where you are at?
Yes. So one of the very first little books I ever put out a few years ago was called One Last Thing, which is, I think it's still on Amazon somewhere, but it's all the most kind of funny, curious, and weird responses I've ever got to EVPs. And so the two that stand out the most to me is one time I said, can you tell me what you see? And the response was, everything at once was the response I got. And that is kind of shaking when you think about that, like looking at infinity of every possibility, everything all at one time.
It's like Dr. Manhattan from the Watchmen or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. And then there was one time when I asked, is there someone with you? And the response was everyone. And then, because I was doing EVP back in the day where I couldn't listen to it until after I stopped recording. And so my next question was, is there anyone with you? And the response was everyone. And my next question was, who is with you? And the response was, even people from space. And so, yeah. So like that screwed me up, because here I am, like, if I'm talking to a ghost or some kind of entity in another realm, like they're experiencing every potential and future possibility and past possibility all happening at once, and there's space people there with them. This is way more fucked up than just talking to a ghost that might have died in a house.
Right. You know, and I love the way you talked about, you're saying we're going to spend a lot more time dead than alive. So this is our liminal, you know, we talk about the time between worlds, like 80 years, if you're lucky, right? This is our liminal time.
This is the liminal state. When people say like, oh, there's these liminal areas where strange shit happens. Life is where strange shit happens. Because it's a liminal state. It's between, before you were born, you didn't exist forever. And then when you die, you'll go back to that maybe. I mean, whatever you are, you're more not this right now.
That's an awesome way to put it. John, a couple questions. People have been like, what's on that map behind you? Like, where are those places?
Oh, so I've been doing, I've spent the past like year and a half, almost 2 years now, with categorizing and trying to locate these weird, like, I've been calling them form-a-nauts. So I was originally calling them humanoid encounters because people were seeing weird humanoid type alien, maybe ghost things.
And this time they're seeing George Foreman? Sorry, stupid dad jokes.
It's all right. But I started calling them form-a-nauts because it just means sailors of form. And it was because they stopped, at a certain point, they stopped being humanoid shaped. Some of them are just triangles, but they have legs. Some of them seem to be robots that are multi-armed. They ceased a certain point about 8 months ago, being humanoid formed. So I started just calling them form-a-nauts, but that's where most of the occurrences have taken place. So that's what that map is back there.
Dude, I love that. Just the idea, like, he's not just like, it's not like, oh yeah, these are UFO sightings. These people saw winged humanoids. These are where we saw a very
walking triangle and walking triangle, a furry box, 3 foot by 3 foot square that moves through fences and trees. Like really, really bizarre experiences that people have been having.
Right. That almost seems like, you know, getting back to that machinery else type thing. You know, people talk about the hallucinations they have on psychedelics and all those kind of things. And that's what that makes me think of. Like, even if they're not on psychedelics, they see something that's not just kind of weird. Oh, it's a snake that looks like it's a reptile, looks like a person. You know, it's not just something out of movies like that. I think that's a cool thing, because when we're talking about the archetypes, you're looking for stuff like, well, this isn't something people would have seen in a movie. what they're seeing is something that nobody else has seen ever.
So one of the form-a-nauts that I've talked about at other lectures was I went into this neighborhood because this guy saw a black triangle, which was about 2 feet big, but it had legs. It had little legs underneath it, and it had really bright. He said it looked like LED lights on the top of it, and it was running around his neighborhood.
It's a personification of a "They Might Be Giants" song.
Maybe, yes. So I went around the neighborhood and did what a lot of researchers don't do, which is just door knock. And have you seen anything strange in your neighborhood? Have you seen? And about 2 blocks away, there was a guy. I wasn't telling him what I was looking for. And the guy said, the only thing strange that I've seen is, and it was the exact same night. He didn't know what night I was looking for. It was the exact same night. And he said that he had seen a black cat that was on fire running through his neighborhood. Well, the thing is like, here you go. They're seeing the same thing. But like, one guy's brain is imaginative enough to see a triangle with legs with LED lights on it. The other guy can't see that. So the black cat that's on fire. And I was like, was it screaming? And he was like, no. He's like, and it wasn't really running. It was just kind of like moving down the street. So like, they saw the same thing, but they described it totally different.
I love it. The black cat on fire. Like, just that, like,
that's weirder than a black triangle walking around on legs.
I would tell that story to everybody.
Like a black cat slowly walking around the neighborhood, but he's on fire.
Yeah, don't sweat it, guys.
Yeah.
Okay, just a couple more things, and we're going to give John a couple more questions, and just thank you so much for your time today. It's always a pleasure and always fun and funny and enjoyable.
No, I love it. This gets me, I was telling you off camera before, my dad went in the hospital like 2 days ago. So this is a great like break up from all of that nonsense.
Sure. The families. And of course, I appreciate that. Allison and I have old parents too. And it's always like crossing our fingers.
Right.
Somebody asked, what do you recommend for books? So if there was somebody who's like, hey, is there a like a paranormal book you've read, or it's just a book in general you've read that may not be on the usual syllabus that might inspire people, or you're like, everybody should read this one?
It's interesting because I think that people should have as broad and as diverse interests as possible, because that's how you learn a lot of stuff. If you were really interested in paranormal phenomena, like you should start out very basic. Like I used to tell people, and I think I'm going to go back to this. I used to tell people, like, even if you don't want to, like, go to your library and go to the kids' book section. If you really want to start being a paranormal investigator, then start where kids start, and start with something that's very basic, very simple, very easy to read. You can burn through all the books in one day, and then move into like the young readers section. And then go to the paranormal section for adults. Like, don't start in the adult section, because you're going to be like, well, that just sounds fucked up and that's stupid. But when you build up like patterns, and it's very like, it really does. It sounds like really crazy to do, but I think that that's important for people to do, because you'll also read something and be like, oh, I need to read that Edith Hamilton book on mythology. I also need to read this book on folklore. And you discover that the way children discover things. And you know what? Children are one of the best indicators and insights into the world of the paranormal, because they experience it and they haven't been taught that it doesn't exist yet.
That's a great point. There's a guy named Daniel Cohen. He just died last year. And when I grew up, I must have, all his books in the library. Like, I would just have a new book of his every week and read it. And I think that sets you up for, you get all the basics. Plus all of it, it's all explained in a very, like a kid-friendly way, means they don't have some kind of, they're not trying to prove a point, about something.
Well, and so there's a secondary kind of, component to that too, which I didn't mention, but I guess I will, and kind of, so like, as a person who thinks magically about the universe too, like, it's also an attempt to get people to return to a sense of childlike wonder. Like, when you go into the kids section, you're going to see books that you saw when you were a little kid, and you're going to start thinking about when you were a little kid, and you're going to start seeing the world like you did when you were a little kid. And that can be a wonderful place. It's not always a wonderful place, but it is a place where you started to learn, and it's a place that you started your path. And a lot of times you forget. Sometimes on Twitter or on eBay, you'll be looking for something to buy and you'll see a game that you forgot about from 30 years ago. And all of a sudden, all these memories pop back into your mind and you start making new connections. And then you find yourself reading stuff that you didn't know that you wanted to read. You know, when I was investigating UFOs, I didn't want to read a United States Air Force manual from 1953 on F-89C Scorpion inlet scoop jet engine valves. But like I did because I was like, ooh, this has to do with UFOs. Like I got super excited to read a stupid technical manual from 1953. And that happens with a childlike sense of wonder.
You know, and it's funny, Allison, my sister, actually for Christmas gave me like, oh, it's somewhere in the paranormal book collection now, but all these like these British books we read when we were kids because they were in the library, and somebody re-released them, and it's like, remember this? And I'm like, of course I remember. This is the first time. Like I remembered the single page with the ghost picture that I could only look at for 2 seconds and then have to close it and be like I have to dare myself to open it up, and it just makes you excited about this stuff again. And that is a hard thing to do sometimes when you have to, like, oh, I remember life without mortgages.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in our community, this is a fun thing to do too if people want to do something while they're at home during quarantine. Like go on eBay and look for type haunted and then type Scholastic Book Club, right? And then all of a sudden you're going to see these books and you're like, oh shit, I forgot about that one. I had that one. I read that one when I was in 3rd grade. And you're going to end up, then they're like $2 or $3. And then all of a sudden you get this excitement, this, again, that childhood play. I'm going to have fun. And when you play, the universe plays back.
And, I think that's a perfect quote to end tonight. When you play, the universe plays back. And number one, everybody out there, go to John's website, check out his t-shirts, check out all that stuff, and make sure when he comes to a convention near you or a theater, we just saw him in the Wisconsin Dells earlier this year, had a great time, that you check him out. Everybody, thank you for joining us Saturday, the Milwaukee Paracon 2020 online. I know it's more fun when we're all in person, but this is where we're going to be for a little bit yet until they figure everything out. So as long as we're here, we might as well be here, talk weird. John, is there any other things that people can find you or anything else you need to promote?
Nope, I don't want to promote. I hate promoting. Okay. I'm a terrible businessman. This is how I end all of my lectures, though. I have to end it this way because this is how I end all my lectures, which is... So, 2 things, actually. I'm going to end it with 2. One is we live in very strange times, and obviously everyone is experiencing different levels of hardship. So be kind, be caring. And the second thing, after being kind and caring, is for all of the time and energy and effort that you expend trying to experience strange creatures that live in some other realm of existence or some other possible reality, I implore you and beg you, please, to spend half as much time and energy and effort exploring and getting to know all of the weird creatures that live with you in this one right now. So thank you for watching, and have a good night. And now I don't know how to log out.
Paranormal investigation from the Milwaukee Chudnow Museum of Yesteryear. Once again, go to weirdlectures.com with the fantastic John Tenney. And thank you so much for your time, everybody, today. And we'll see you tonight, 8 p.m. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., we're back for a meditation with Goddess Aria going into the Emerald Forest. Have a good night, everybody. We'll see you at the Paranormal Investigation, and we'll see you tomorrow at Milwaukee Paracon.